Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of this finishing series for putting finished products on tooled leather. And in part 1 we talked about an oil covering, and we used Neat's Foot oil on all of our different pieces that we had. So if you missed that video, be sure and go back and check that. Coming after the oil, once that oil's dried in there, the next thing I'm going to come with here on this piece is doing a dyed background. So this piece is one of the ones we tooled with the bar grounder for the backgrounds. And I'm going to be coming in with the Fiebing's leather dye. And I'll show you that bottle at the end here. But I use just a fine tip detail brush. Nothing super expensive. I usually get mine from like a Hobby Lobby or some kind of craft store. It's where I seem to find these ones that I like. And when I get dye on my brush, I'm going to do this under the camera one time so you can see, but I'll dip that brush in there and then dab it off. You can see that kind of run on the edge of the container there. I dab that off so I don't have a whole lot of extra on my brush, because as you can see when I put that down, that built up dye in the brush will run on the leather. And you want to use that to your advantage, but don't let it be to your disadvantage. If we have too much dye on there, especially in these smaller areas, it can run past where we want the dye to be. So be really careful. Slow is better till you get the hang of that dye running to where you can use that to your advantage. You see, just tapping that down there, it runs pretty dang far. So I always try to put my brush down towards the center of any one particular space when I start, just to make sure that it doesn't run too far over. Once it hits and runs the first time, I can usually tell how far it's going to go and control that a little bit better. Now, project with bigger background spots, you can get away with a little bit more dye on your brush and let it run further, but most of the spaces in this project are pretty small, so we're going to be taking it fairly careful. There's one space on here that's a little bit bigger. I'll be able to show you right there, a little bit more dye on my brush, and let that run a bit too. Once you get control over how that flow works, you can really roll along and go pretty quick with the dye work. The nice thing about the dye is it does hit and run and gets really good coverage. When we get into our painted backgrounds, where we're using an actual acrylic paint, I'll show you how we have to go over a little bit more to get that good even coverage. We got one of these belt samples that I had left the background smooth on, just intentionally to do the painted backgrounds and show you the coverage that we get there. Okay, so this bigger spot, I'm going to leave just a little bit more dye on my brush. So see how that can run quite a ways if you let it. Now this is where having good crisp bevel lines is going to really help your dye work. The more crisp your lines are and the deeper that trough is, then that dye can hit and run right down it without creeping up your vine work too bad. Okay, we got just a few more spaces on here. And again, if you're just joining us, this is part 2 of the finish series. In part 1, we went through and oiled all of our pieces. So every piece we go back to now is going to have a coat of neat's foot oil on it. That was wiped on and then left to dry. So this has already had that coat on there, and that's going to help it take this dye work super even as well. Now, once my dye is on here, how long does it have to dry for before our next step? Well, till it's good and dry. So the nice thing about this dye is it does dry pretty darn fast. If you were pushing it, you could probably come back 10-15 minutes and lacquer over this and get by with it. But probably a good rule of thumb, if you can manage it, if you're not in too big of a hurry on stuff, try to let each of your products sit for about an hour, and then that's gonna let them all set in there pretty darn well, and be able to move on to that next step. Could be a little overkill, but that way you just know everything's good and dry and you don't have to worry about it so bad. But there we have it. We have some dyed backgrounds on there. Pretty quick and simple. Again, the biggest thing is learning how to control the flow of that dye as it comes off your brush, because it's going to hit that dry leather and run. So being able to control that and use it to your advantage and not your disadvantage. Don't let it get the best of you. But I was going to just pick this camera up and show you really quick the label on this dye here. This particular color we're using is Cordovan, but it's the Phoebeans leather dye. The Pro dye I also really like. Most of my colors come in Pro dye. For some reason this Cordovan, when I got it, they didn't have the Pro dye in it, so I got that in just the regular leather dye. But the other label you'll see, this is mahogany here, but that's a Pro dye, and that I really like as well. So anyhow, I hope this helps. Again, follow along with this series. We're gonna continue on to get a complete finish on our tooled leather products. There's a couple links down or in the description you can follow if you want to check out any of the patterns on the website that I have, or a link to Weaver Leather Supply to be able to save you 10% on any of the products as well. So hope you guys have a great day, and I appreciate you taking the time to jump on and join me here.